The gospel writer Luke has structured his telling of the Jesus story around Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. In Luke's telling, then, everything that Jesus does in his ministry is done while he is making his way to his own trial, crucifixion, and resurrection. When you put things in that perspective, it helps us, I think, to see that Jesus truly did live out a remarkable kind of selfless love. Even as he journeys toward his own death, he takes time to notice people. He takes time to work miracles, to heal others. Even as his own life is drawing to an end, he is pointing others to life, to the fullness of life that is ours in God. Here Luke tells us that Jesus is passing by a village near the border of Samaria and Galilee. Jesus is out there on the border, but we already know that, right? We know that about Jesus. He was often out there on the border at the edges, not only physically, but politically and theologically. So as he passes through a village, he hears 10 lepers calling out to him. In that day, as you may know, lepers were exiled from their own communities. They were sent to live on the outskirts of town. They were relegated to leper colonies, if you will. They were forbidden from being in contact with other people since their skin diseases were often considered highly contagious. Many people, of course, believed that their diseases were the result of their sins, so they also lived as social outcasts. Their illnesses, some thought, must be punishment from God, so not only were they physically afflicted, they were also regarded as spiritually unclean by others, that they were somehow deserving of whatever misery life held for them. As a result, they could not work or maintain a livelihood, and so they spent most of their time begging for those who passed by. It appears, though, in the story that some of them had found strength in numbers. Perhaps these 10 mentioned in the story had band together, perhaps for survival, or perhaps because it's true what they say, that misery loves company. But for whatever reason, the 10 of them seem to have become some sort of a community drawn together by their common affliction. And it appears that their shared leprosy took precedent over their other personal attributes and characteristics. In this particular group, it seems, ethnic prejudice seems to have been abandoned. Despite the fact that racial biases were strong in this world at that time, these lepers looked at each other, it seems, and simply saw fellow lepers. They didn't see a Jew with leprosy or a Samaritan with leprosy, just a leper, someone who was in the same boat as they were. In situations of hardship, it does seem, does it not, that people often focus on their commonalities rather than their differences. We see this in the news. I can think back to when Hurricane Harvey hit, and you saw people unite across all kinds of artificial lines in order to bond together in our common humanness and care for each other in times of need. We see that again and again and again in our world. But Luke tells us in this story that despite all of his concerns, despite his heavy heart, as Jesus journeyed even closer to the cross, he saw this band of suffering individuals. He saw them, truly saw them. He heard their cries. He noticed them, and we're told that he healed them. And I think there's an important lesson about discipleship in this story. Jesus saw people. He saw them. And if we're to be disciples of Christ, we must learn to see others as well. Now, I don't mean just seeing with our eyes. I mean we must really see them. We must understand them in that, oh, I see kind of way. You know, I was thinking about this, and I wonder, how many people did I not see this past week? How many people did I have conversations with? How many people did I interact with, but because I was so preoccupied with myself, so caught up in where my own life was taking me, that I really didn't see? How many times, I wonder, did I look right at and yet look right through someone else, treating that person as if they were invisible or insignificant instead of the precious children of God they really are? How many of them left my presence feeling ignored? How many of them walked and went away feeling that I had somehow disregarded them? But in this story, Jesus saw them. He understood what the lepers needed. He understood they were in need of healing. They needed to be made well so that they could get on with living life to its fullest. For too long, these 10 had been there on the outskirts of town, cast away from those they loved, from the people and places and the activities they knew best. For too long, their physical illness had kept them from enjoying life in all its fullness. They'd been cut off from their families. They'd been cut off from their friends, from their community, and even their religious groups, cut off from all that, the many relationships that made life most meaningful. But Jesus saw. He saw them. And he told them to go and show themselves to the priest. Now that's interesting, because you see, in that day, it was required that if a person were cured of a skin disease or any disease, that they had to go to the priest and show themselves cured so that the priest could then declare them once again clean. Only then, after that happened, could they rejoin the community. But what's really interesting in this story is that Jesus sends them off to confirm their healing even before they have evidence that they've been healed. They're not even healed yet Jesus sends them off to the priest to be declared clean. It's an act of faith for the lepers, is it not? They had to do what Jesus has told them to do, even though it may not in that moment make sense, and it's an act of faith for us. I wonder how many of us readily do what Jesus has told us, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Well, these 10 did. And on their way to see the priest, they are in fact healed of their leprosy. One of them, when he saw that he had been healed, returned and praised God with a loud voice. Now, no doubt, all 10 lepers physically saw that their diseases had been cured, but only one of them was apparently able to really see. He saw. He saw past the gift of healing to the giver who healed. I suspect that that was the real gift Jesus had intended for all 10 of those lepers. But in the story, only one of them seems to have received it. This one leper, the Samaritan of all the people, was able to recognize not just the wonderful gift, but also the wonderful giver of the gift. 10 lepers were physically healed that day, but one leper was made well. The translation of that word actually means whole. He was made whole. He was given the gift of physical healing, but he was also given and chose to claim the gift of a relationship with God, the giver of the healing. Remember, none of the rest got to actually meet Jesus. None of the rest, we're told, knelt at his feet. None of the rest heard him proclaim, "Your faith has made you whole." The one who returned enjoyed physical healing, just like the rest, but he also enjoyed spiritual healing. They were healed, all 10, but one leper in the story was made whole. And I believe this 10th leper also saw how to live life in a whole new way. How easy it would have been for him to complain to God about how he'd been treated all these years out there on the fringe, on the edge. How easy it would have been to feel sorry for himself and just sit down and give up. How easy it would be to accept this gift he'd been given, but never see it as enough or sufficient recompense for the hardship he'd already endured. But instead, despite all of his troubles and heartaches, he saw that God is still at work in this world. He saw that God still cares for the least and the last and the lost. He saw that in Jesus, the message was made loud and clear that God has not abandoned us. God has not given up on us. God has not left us to our own pitiful attempts to get by and just make do. No, This leper was given the gift of being able to live out a life of true gratefulness for the gift. I suspect he never saw sunrise again in the same old way. I suspect he never heard a bird sing that it didn't make his heart happy. I suspect he never again touched the face of a little child without realizing that all of life is a precious gift from God. This is a beautiful story of healing, indeed. It can also be a story about racial blindness. It can be a story about stepping out in faith and doing what Jesus commands even when we don't understand or see. It can be a story about learning to be grateful for the gifts of God we are given. But for me, I think it's also a story about the healing of how the healing of leprosy gave the gift of sight. One who had been made well learned to see life in a whole new way. I think it's a story about seeing the world as Jesus did as well, as God would have us to see, as Colin talked about in his wonderful children's sermon earlier. It's a story about living out the great commandment to love God and love your neighbor. For me, the story of the healing of the 10 lepers is a story about learning to see the giver of the gift. Love the Lord your God. Acknowledge the giver of life, the creator, redeemer, and sustainer. And it's about learning to see the other. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Acknowledge those with whom you have so much in common, those who like you need God's grace to be made whole. Luke says he saw, and he did. Jesus saw his neighbor, and he helped point that neighbor to God. And the neighbor saw the one who healed and made him whole, and he praised God with a loud voice. He saw. The question is, do we see? Do we see? Thanks be to God. Amen.